I'm Richard Alm, and I'm a writer-in-residence at Bridwell Institute. Bob Lawson, the Institute's director, is traveling, and I'll be the one who's making the trains run on time. This is the 11th Texas Economic Forum. The first 7 were on campus, in person, and the next 3 were Zoom events. And it's good to see faces. I think we'd like to see more of them, but we're very happy that you're here. The purpose of the Texas Economic Forum is very simple. You discuss economic issues important to Texas and DFW. Today's topic is the Texas model and people of color. I wrote that, but I should have wrote it this way: the Texas model of economic freedom. Because the Texas model is not exclusive to Texas, and it is a model, though, of economic freedom. Low taxes, light regulation, letting the private sector and markets do most of the heavy lifting in terms of growth and job creation. This model has been very successful for Texas over the past 2 decades. You'll see that in terms of GDP growth, we've outstripped the rest of the United States. The United States, 30% growth, but we had 70% growth in those 2 decades. And you'll notice the Great Recession, the oil price fall did not significantly impede Texas's economic progress. And the same goes for job creation. We've outclassed the United States as a whole by quite a lot margin. Now, if you had noted when the census numbers first came out a month or so ago, these are the latest numbers, and you will notice that there's been a rather substantial shift in the ethnic composition of the Texas population, and you can see the divisions with the numbers on the right. Bottom line, of course, is that Texas has become much more diversified, and we get to the question of whether this economic model that's been so good for us in the last 2 decades is it good for all Texans, whites, Hispanics, blacks, and Asian Americans, or is it just good for certain groups? Now, Dr. Cox is going to tackle that question head on as our second speaker. But first, we're going to welcome Peter Lewin, and he's going to talk about the simple common sense economics of racial discrimination. And then at the end, we'll have Frank Martin, who's going to speak on Americans of African heritage have made notable advances in free enterprise. I'm not going to spend any more time trying to tell you what these academic credentials of these gentlemen. I figure you all can do the Googling if you really want to know. But now, join me in welcoming Peter Lewin.
Well, thank you, Rick. Can you hear me okay? Thank you, Rick, for the invitation. I appreciate being able to discuss, take part in this discussion of some very important and timely issues at this point in America. I, too, welcome the ability to get among people in person rather than just through Zoom. I'm back semester at my university, UT Dallas. for the first time in 14 months, and I'm really enjoying it. And it's events like this also that remind me that I'm alive. My task today, I understand we're on a very tight schedule, so I'm going to stick pretty closely to a text that I've written out in the interests of time, and as opportunity and time allows, I can elaborate on that in questions and answers and so on. So my task today is to explain the basic economics of racial discrimination, or for that matter, any kind of discrimination based on group characteristics. I cannot imagine a time in America since the civil rights era when this has been more relevant and more misunderstood. The social justice agenda is determined not to allow a rational, common sense discussion of these issues, which makes it all the more important to have that discussion. And I hope my remarks here today will be a small contribution to that. Some quick background. I grew up in Johannesburg, South Africa, under the apartheid regime, a system of state-mandated discrimination, not unlike the legislative system of the Jim Crow era in the South. When I went to the University of Chicago to do my PhD, I encountered Gary Becker, whose PhD dissertation was entitled The Economics of Discrimination. And for reasons I will explain, his work did not address the case of state-enforced discrimination, so I proposed to him that I do my dissertation on the economics of apartheid, which is what I did. Understandably, this has been one of my research interests ever since, and I have on occasion given testimony in federal court as an expert witness in these cases, discrimination cases, which I suppose is the reason I'm here today. So let me start with the simple economics of discrimination. It's really quite a straightforward application of how the classical liberal principles of private property and the pursuit of self-interest play out in a market economy. Imagine an economy with a competitive labor market in which some employers discriminate against black workers on the basis of their race for whatever reason, while other employers do not discriminate and will hire the best person for the job, regardless of their race. Discriminating employers may hire black workers into the same job as white workers, but will do so only at a discount, maybe giving the job a different job title. While some discriminating employers will not hire black workers at all. At first, black workers will only be able to get a job equivalent to white workers at a discount. In such a market, black workers compete by offering to work for a lower wage. What this means is that employers who are non-discriminators will have a cost advantage by hiring only black workers. Over time, non-discriminators will outcompete the discriminating employers unless the discriminators stop discriminating. The process works to eradicate discriminatory behavior because there is a price to be paid for discriminating. It works better and faster the more competitive the labor market. Let me pause to note that this is essentially the same sort of situation that existed in our history in America in the late 19th century and the turn of the 20th century, when large numbers of immigrants of diverse cultures entered the labor market. In order to get jobs, these immigrants had at first to overcome the reluctance of employers to hire them, either because the employers were prejudiced or simply because the immigrants were unknown entities that needed to prove themselves. And the result has been an amazing amount of social mobility as immigrants have become absorbed into the economy as equals. What is true for discrimination against workers by employers is also true for any kind of discrimination in an open market. Those businesses that discriminate against customers because of their race will lose out to those that do not. Those workers who refuse to work with workers of a different race will find fewer job opportunities in an open market. Competition punishes all kinds of discrimination in the marketplace. Significantly, this argument applies regardless of the reasons for discrimination. There is an important difference between prejudice, like racism, and discrimination. The former refers to an attitude. The latter refers to a behavior. For example, employers may discriminate for a variety of reasons. They may be racist, or they may erroneously believe that race signals productivity. Doesn't matter for the working of the process. Competition tends to favor those who employ the best workers at the lowest acceptable wage. Similarly, even racist employers may not discriminate in employment because they understand it is costly to do so. Private attitudes are all but irrelevant, and policies such as those found in the new social justice agenda that target attitudes like inherent bias and white privilege are at best misguided. Obviously, this free market argument is not new. Yet it is one that is seldom heard these days, and there are indeed a few possible objections against it. The one common objection is just false. It states that in order for free market competition to successfully erode discrimination, it must be the case that employers have full or perfect information about the productivity of potential workers. This claim betrays a misunderstanding of how markets actually work. As F.A. Hayek, famous Austrian economist, put it, competition is a discovery procedure. Information is always costly to obtain, and knowledge is widely dispersed. Employers never have full information, and they learn from experience. What matters is not that they know for sure what a worker is worth, quote unquote, to them, but that they are prepared to pay any worker revealed to be worth the same to the same wage, that they will pay workers who are revealed themselves to be worth the same wage. In any case, as I shall explain, employers, while not having perfect knowledge, certainly know a lot more than any regulators purporting to make a fairer choice. Two other common objections are that the process takes too long and that it relies on there being a sufficient number of non-discriminators. Okay, so clearly it's possible that at any point of time there will be a large number of discriminating employers, for example, and that non-discriminators would need time to make inroads into the market. This is an empirical matter. How long should we expect the market process to take to eradicate discrimination by revealing that it is unprofitable relative to not discriminating? Obviously, it depends on the circumstances. But if one goes by history, it turns out to work incredibly quickly, within one generation or less. One need only look at the situation in the American South today and see how it has changed over the last few decades. Of course, some will say that it's a result of affirmative action. But for reasons that will become apparent, I think this is a bad argument. Still, it is one that cannot be proven one way or another, so one has to consider the alternatives. If one believes that relying on the free market to work its magic is just unacceptable because it may take too long, what is one to do? And this is where all of the various race-based, gender-based, ethnicity-based, social justice, labor market policies come from. They reflect a vision of government policy that is somehow able to achieve a fairer labor market outcome than could be achieved by the workings of the free market. It is a form of central planning in which the judgment of the planners preempt the judgment of the employers, of the workers, customers, etc. I want to argue that anti-discrimination regulation is not only ineffective and inefficient, but also counterproductive. Like all regulation, labor market regulation, and I'm going to consider a particular version of labor market regulation, equal employment regulation, or equal employment opportunity regulation. Like all regulation, it faces obvious and serious knowledge and incentive problems. There are always unintended consequences and costs. We may examine this by using the example of wages. Presumably, the objective of the regulation is to ensure that race bias does not result in lower pay for equally qualified workers. To construct a regulation to ensure this, one has to provide a way of deciding who is equally qualified. More specifically, when a complaint of pay discrimination is lodged with the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission, the agency must decide whether the complainant is equally qualified in comparison to those who are receiving higher pay. More simply, are doing the same job. In place of the judgment of the employer, the agency or some paid expert will have to insert their own judgment to decide whether the pay gap is justified. But clearly, the agency cannot know as much about the business as the employers. How can the agency know how much of the gap is due to legitimate judgment of the employer about differences in productivity of the workers and how much is due to bias? To complicate matters, and this is important, should the issue come to a court of law, the procedure followed will be, as I suggested above, to use experts to produce a study to control for productivity factors as much as possible, and to observe if any pay gap still remains and attribute it to discrimination. If after this exercise gap remains, right, common in such proceedings that such findings will be regarded as sufficient for the plaintiff to have established a prima facie case. And then the burden of proof will shift on the employer to show that he has not discriminated. And the presumption of innocence is now removed. Needless to say, since it is very difficult to prove a negative, the negative of no discrimination, many of these cases are resolved with costly settlements. Even more likely, employers will work hard and spend significant resources to avoid such lawsuits by ensuring that minorities are paid sufficiently to deter such complaints, even if it means paying them more than they are worth in terms of unbiased business judgment. In other words, this kind of regulation, in trying to prevent pay discrimination, actually causes discrimination against non-minorities. The same logic applies to hiring in an affirmative action environment, where less qualified minority workers are likely to get hired in order to avoid any presumption of discrimination bias. Affirmative action is actually affirmative discrimination. If discrimination is immoral, one wonders how it can be justified in any context. So, perverse incentives operate in a number of ways. Employers anxious to avoid costly and risky lawsuits and administrative penalties have a strong incentive to resort to race-based quotas, even at the cost of efficiency. And by the same token, minority workers have an incentive to threaten to play the race card to obtain special treatment. And government agencies wanting to ensure their own survival have an incentive to pursue cases, to get convictions, and to provoke settlements, which is how their performance is judged. All this tends to bolster resentment connected to race. It also disadvantages honorable, diligent, and efficient minority workers who find themselves judged first by their race and then have to prove their abilities to overcome the suspicion of special treatment. A particularly stark example of this, quite well known, is the preferential treatment given to black student applicants to college. Black applicants are in many institutions admitted with test scores a few hundred points below those of their white and Asian counterparts. The result is that many underprepared black students are admitted to programs in which they are likely to fail and to attract attention for doing so. This program is thus doubly counterproductive in first failing to benefit the people it is designed to benefit, and secondly, in increasing discrimination and race consciousness by discriminating against whites and Asian applicants. In addition, it fails to address the fundamental reasons so few black students are unprepared for these high-level colleges to which they are encouraged to apply. By targeting diversity of admissions, notably not of graduations, the focus is on the symptoms, not on the causes. And it is just one example of the incredibly simplistic mindset that values race diversity for its own sake and seeks to solve social problems by forcing the racial proportions in any endeavor to mirror the proportions in the population. All in all, in similar ways, anti-discrimination regulation is a problematic bag of tricks with unpleasant surprises. The economics of discrimination, such as I have explained, suggests that such regulation may actually retard the erosion of discrimination and that we would be better off without it. In any reasonably competitive labor market, competition works to erode discriminatory behavior and also discriminatory attitudes. As a result, because people who behave in a non-discriminatory way, they will interact with a greater diversity of individuals and often overcome their initial biases and prejudices. No system has ever been more successful in reducing the effect of bias in race, class, and other such designations than competitive capitalism. A final word on regulation. The economic argument against race-based regulation and other related policies is separate from but complementary to the moral argument. From a classical liberal perspective, discrimination is odious, but should not be illegal, because making it illegal violates basic individual freedoms like freedom of contract, freedom of association, and freedom of expression. From a classical liberal perspective, I'm almost done, the state should never regulate matters of private morality. As I explained, I'm particularly sensitive to these matters because race and economics is an area of specialization for me as an economist. And in his work on discrimination, Gary Becker did not consider situations in which the government supporting a white minority imposed racially discriminatory laws. This was the case in South Africa and also in the Jim Crow South legislation. And so I realized in such situations, governments can prevent or retard the process by which free markets erode discrimination. And this leads to the prediction that when such discriminatory laws are removed, allowing freedom of choice, even biased choice, discrimination and bias will gradually, if not immediately, disappear. And this is exactly what has happened in our experience in history. In both cases, apartheid and Jim Crow, the power of the state was used to harness racial prejudice to protect white economic interests. Apartheid was a policy to protect white workers from competition from black workers by prohibiting the employment of black workers in white jobs. And similar policies operated in Jim Crow American South. Slavery itself was only viable in the presence of state protection, subsidizing and mandatory return of runaway slaves. So, let me conclude by saying that the current public discourse evidences little, if any, understanding of this, nor indeed of the negative role that government must play if it enters into the realm of what should be private decision-making. Thank you.
Peter? Next up, Mike Cox, Bridwell Institute.
Okay. Oh, wow. More people. I go very fast, so I'm going to get going here before Rick cuts me off. Okay, Markets and Minorities in Texas. We're borrowing from the title of a book by my friend Walter Williams, who died on December of 2019, I believe. We hate to see him go because he was such an icon. And we're going to honor him in our annual report this year. All right, we set out to do this study because we care about people, all people. And we believe that an economic system that allows all kinds of people to flourish is the best kind of system. Want to see something really beautiful? This is it. The human color palette. There is one race, the human race. We make a lot about to do about blacks and whites and Hispanics and Asians and so on. That's an artificial dichotomy, trichotomy, allocotomy, whatever you want to call it, makeup thing that seems to have gotten worse over time. From the days I was growing up visiting Mississippi, loving on my grandmother's black maid, Janora, who my father put through college, her kids, I mean. And it seems like the media and government have done more to separate the races from each other and to pull us together, because there seems to be value in doing that to them. Markets don't have an incentive to do that, as Peter was talking about. So I want to show you what markets, Texas markets, have done to reward people of color, which we all are. I have color. Numerous studies have shown that freer people tend to have their lives improved in so many ways, produce more, have more opportunity, get more education, and blah, 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 on down this list, including experiencing less discrimination, respecting each other more, but also earning higher income and enjoying higher consumption. These are the things we're going to focus on mainly here. Higher living standards. This is true not just for whites, but it's also true for blacks, Hispanics, and Asians. We're going to focus specifically on the after-tax real income of each of these racist ethnicities and show that it tends to be the highest in states that are the most economically free and the lowest in states that are the least economically free. Economic freedom measures on that are produced right here in our Bridwell Center. We didn't start them here, but we collected the people who do those things. Back when I became the director of the center in 2009, not long after that, I hired Bob Lawson, who produces the annual Economic Freedom of the World report. Later on, Dean Stanzel, who produces the Economic Freedom of North America report, where we compare states and also cities and metropolitan areas. So here we're looking at how the states fare in terms of economic freedom, measured in terms of regulation, taxes, labor market freedom, freedom to trade amongst the states, freedom of banking within the states, and a whole bunch of other measures. I have in green there the states that are the most economically free, and then the ones that are in the middle from 11 to 40, and then the least economically free. You can see where Texas is and Florida is, and you can see where California and New York are, with the help of Ocasio-Cortez keeping them solidly in the bottom, number 50. So you can see the highs and the lows there. The most free quintile, fifth of states, and the least free. So what we did is we took data on income from annual wage and salary earnings from the Department of Census, 5-year averages from 2015 to 19. For people who are employed in a private for-profit company, we're interested in seeing if companies, not the government, but companies, how well they are paying people of different races and ethnicities. In their sweet spot of their working life, 25 to 64. Whites, blacks, and Asians, all non-Hispanic and Hispanics. We separated males and females. We looked at people, we want to do as close as possible. We want to compare people of the same gender, with the level of education, in the same field if we can, in the same job, hopefully the same age if possible, just of a different race or ethnicity in a different state. It's not always possible to do that because you get down to where you have too few levels of observation, and so we have to sometimes look at compare people of the same educational level, or people of in the same field of degree with the same educational level, or people in the same job. And that's what we did. We took the tax data. We said, okay, you live in California, yes, you make more, but you don't get to keep that, so we take your taxes away. If you live in California, we take your taxes away. If you live in Texas, your state income taxes, but you have none. So we take taxes away, and then we adjust for the cost of living in those respective states using price deflators that come from C2ER, the Council for Community Economic Research. And then our economic freedom measures come from Dean Stanzel here, Economic Freedom of North America. So let me show you the results of this study, first by educational attainment. We're going to first look at results by educational attainment for people who compare high school grads to high school grads, college grads to college grads, and so on. Then we'll look at the results for America's more educated population, people bachelor's and above, and then we'll look at the results for people on comparable job levels. All right. Beginning with whites. How do high school, so on every one of these charts, you're going to see, once you get used to one of these, you'll have the same rubric for the rest of them, okay? Highest level of economic freedom on down to the lowest level of economic freedom. So the highest there is the fifth of American states that is the most economically free. To the right there, the fifth of American states, New York and California and so on, that have the least economic freedom. High school degree, the fifth of American states has the most economic freedom, pays people with high school degree the most. They have the highest living standards. Bachelor's degree, even a bigger distinction. Master's degree, highest fifth is the freest fifth. Same for the doctorates and same for professional degrees. Hispanics, same story, except for one exception over in the doctorate category. Now, when I look at doctorates, being a doctorate myself, I actually care less about there being that. Because why? Because I know that I work for less for pay and more for lifestyle. So comparing just money to me means less. If I'm a professional or a doctorate degree and I'm looking for lifestyle, it's not the same as if I'm a high school grad, and the money means a lot more to me. Okay. So for blacks, high school degrees, highest pay is found in the states that are most economically free. Same for bachelors, same thing for masters. Again, we see the anomaly over here for the PhDs and so on doing their own thing, and for the professional degrees too. Now, there's a lot of things that can be going on here, and we could have a 30-minute discussion about this. I don't have 30 minutes. I only have 20 for the entire presentation. And unfortunately, we can't even have a confab after this because of COVID. But we don't have to read our annual report, but we get into these issues. Asians, you see the same thing. A decline as we lose economic freedom. We get away from a high income. And usually we always, in almost all cases, we see that in the lowest, in the fifth of America, which has the least economic freedom, where government is supposedly solving the problems, not markets, that's where minorities, that's where everybody is doing the worst. let me turn to the results for the more highly educated segment of the population. People with a bachelor's degree and above, bachelor's, master's, and so on. And we're going to look across degree fields. So I have 53 degree fields, and I'm comparing each race in the same degree field, and then I'm aggregating those up on average across all the degree fields. At first on population, I'm doing averages that equally weighted, as if I'm a math major. I don't care, what you are. I'm a math major. So I'm going to equally weight all the fields, and then down here, I'm going to weight the fields by population weights because there's a whole lot more business majors, that's the number one major, than there are journalism majors. So these weights down here are population weighted. These weights are equally weighted. No matter how you weight it, what you see is that the highest paid, that people in the most economically free part of America, the highly educated population, gets paid the most in the most economically free part of America. For whites, for Asians, slightly higher bar over there in the middle fifth. But when we do the population weights, there's a bigger. This is how much the lowest level of economic freedom punishes highly educated workers for living in their part of America. That's the wage gap that gets created there compared to how much they could be earning in the most economically free part of America. And that gap is 25% for Hispanics, 14% for blacks going back. It's 26% for Asians. Free market states reward America's most educated population more than any other segment of other quintile of states. All right, what about across occupations? This is really where we get the most direct comparison because we can take occupations, and the data on occupations comes in terms of occupations and by level of education. Across 5 levels of education, you're in an occupation. Do you have a high school degree, a bachelor's degree, a master's degree, a doctorate, or a professional degree? It does not come by age, so I can't unfortunately compare tell if you're a 24-year-old or a 50-year-old. But we can look at the data by occupation, and I can compare in the same job with the same level of, oh, by the way, it does not also allow me to look at the field. But I can say in the same job with the same level of education, how does the pay of somebody who's Hispanic compared in a particular state compared to the pay of somebody who's Hispanic in another state, or black in one state compared to black in another state? What do we find? That whites across occupations, in the same occupations, aggregated up across all occupations, weighted by the size of each occupation, whites make the most in the most economically free part of America. Blacks do too, so do Hispanics, and so do Asians across the 70 occupations that we were able to get data on. And we even find that if you look at the income of whites compared to, if you even look at the income of Hispanics relative to whites, and blacks relative to whites, and Asians relative to whites, aggregated up with the share of each one of those minorities in the total share of minorities, the largest group of minorities that Hispanics are the largest group of minorities, but if you aggregate those all up, that in the fifth of America, there is about a 21% gap in the pay of minorities relative to whites. There's about a 21% gap in the pay of minorities overall, and about a 21% gap in the pay of minorities relative to whites in the fifth of American states that are the least free. okay? About 28% of that gap, and that's over here. So I'm saying whatever that gap is, it turns out to be 21%. Let's see how much of that gap gets removed as we move from the least free states to the most free states. 28% of that gap gets removed. It goes down from 21% to under 15%. That's a reduction in the gap of 28%. So there's even less discrimination. Not only do blacks, whites, Asians make a higher living standard as we move to the most free states, the differences between whites and the minorities also get reduced. Now let's focus on Texas and see, what about Texas? So if there's anything I've learned since I moved to Texas 37 years ago, it's that Texans care about Texas. We're crazy about Texas. So I could not do this presentation without answering the question, but what about Texas? How's Texas doing? So here are the two biggest states in each one of these economic quintiles. Texas and Florida in the top quintile, and so on for the other ones. And I'm going to go through 4 slides. Let's first look at educational attainment. Texas, if you have to take, for educational attainment, I have to get down, in order to compare the data, I have to get down to, there's so much data. And when you get down to the absolute state level, you have to eliminate data that's, you got too many missing observations. So you have to give up, you have to go to the top 2 educational levels for which there are data. So here how, having done that, here's your average wage of whites in Texas compared to whites in the other states. Texas, Florida doesn't pay very well compared to the most free market states. Texas does. Texas pays Hispanics very well, the best in America. Texas pays Asians the best in America, and also blacks. Now, what about if we look at America's educated population? How well does Texas, our state, pay highly educated workers? The best in the country. If they're white and Hispanic and Asian and black. Texas model is working. What about if you look at it across, comparing occupation to occupation? Again, it's Texas across the board. The Texas model of economic freedom works to lift the real income and living standards, not just of whites, but of blacks, Asians, and Hispanics to a level that is at or near the top in the nation. That's it.
Now, the best for last.
Oh,
Frank Martin, all the way from New Orleans.
all right. Mike has been a good friend throughout the years. And I have a few more things to say, but I want to just pick up on something. I didn't realize there were all these intersections, with us. And that is your studying under Gary Becker. I went to the University of Chicago. And now, Becker was a student of T.W. Schultz. Yeah. I took classes under T.W. Schultz at the University of Chicago. And I want to mention this. I went to the University of Chicago. I got an undergraduate degree from Michigan State. And then I went to the Brookings Institution to finish my dissertation. Now, there's something, and then I went to Tulane, and then I was getting my PhD from Tulane. And there was something very interesting here. Here you have the University of Chicago, the free market-oriented place. And then there's Tulane, which is an outpost of Chicago, in a sense, like UCLA and those places like that. So there are those, and then there was the Brookings Institution, which is Keynesian. So here I've been in these two different sort of extreme places, and so I've had to weigh them and see where I come. But you know, when I was at the Brookings Institution, there was a young white South African there, Lawrence. What was Lawrence's last name?
Was his last name Lawrence? Robert Lawrence?
Robert Lawrence, yes. Robert Lawrence.
I know him very well.
Yes. Yeah, Robert Lawrence. Yeah, there. And but anyway, I didn't realize we had these intersections. So I want to, and I really, I think these have been great presentations, and I don't know what I'm doing here. But anyway, let me say this. And I was saying, as I look at Mike, what comes to mind is when we took 2 summer classes in the mathematics department while in graduate school at Tulane. A course in numerical techniques and another in non-parametric statistics. Bruno, who looked like a bodybuilder, gave us a good course in numerical techniques. But there was something strange about the course in non-parametric statistics. It was not about non-parametric statistics, except for the last lecture. And I'm sure by then that Mike and I both had several courses in parametric statistics. Nonetheless, it was a good course that offered an opportunity to hone our knowledge of parametric statistics. So I want to first note this, that my presentation will not make use of any complex or sophisticated models of statistics and econometrics. I will use a few numerical tables and look at changes in occupational distribution over time, and changes in median income over time, and over more than 50 years, and changes in per capita income, a measure of standard of living over a 60-year period for Americans of African heritage. Then I'll cite some anecdotal evidence that seemed to go along with this. What we observe has happened. In the title of this presentation, I use the term Americans of African heritage, while in the body of the paper, often use the term Black and African American, because the data sources I use those designations, and plus those two terms are widely used. I use the term Americans of African heritage to emphasize that historically the people in America referred to as Black, colored, Negro, or African American are first and foremost Americans, and have always so viewed themselves for the greatest part of their sojourn in America, going back some 400 years. One could argue that the American of African heritage is the quintessential American, and over the years has refused to turn his back on America and its institutions. The Declaration of Independence, the U.S. Constitution, and our political and economic system of free enterprise. They've always been eager to participate in the free enterprise system of market capitalism, and when the conditions are right, have used the system to great advantage. So can you see those? Yeah, I think you can see those all right. Okay. So first, look at occupational distribution over a period of, this is a long period of time. And this is very aggregated data, and the occupations are very aggregated, very broad. But what the occupational distribution refers to percentage distribution of a group by major occupational categories, as we see here, with these categories here: professional, kindred workers, managers and administrators, on down to private household workers. And what is shown are the percentages for some selected years spread out here over a period of some almost 2 decades here. And earnings differ by occupations, obviously, and though these are very broad. For instance, the highest earning occupations here would be the managers and administrators, and then you have professional and kindred workers. But what we do see is that over this period is that the population or the occupational distribution changed and shifted, and there was an increase in the percent of the black labor force which was in the higher paying occupation. And there was a drop in the percent in the lower paying occupations. The lowest paid was private household workers. These were domestics. And that had gone from 14.2% in 1960 to 3.6% in 1978. So there were these shifts, the occupational shifts. One of the things I did then, and I was really started doing something like this when I was at the Brookings Institution, with trying to get a measure of occupational standing by putting weights on these percentages based on earnings. And when I did that, I come up with one number that sort of gives it's an index, kind of index. Very rough, but it's an index. And so what happened, and when I did my dissertation, I did this index from 59 to 69 because that was the data set. And actually, I went to the actual data there, the actual files, to extract that information at that time. But in any case, what we see is that if we look at that last row up there in Table 1, we see this index of occupational standing was 3.4 in 1960, and then it went up, and then but between 7 and 75 went down, and there was a recession going on there. There's recession, and then it was in 78 it was 3.75. But the main thing is that over this almost 20-year period, there was an increase in the index of occupational standing. There was an improvement in occupational standing. And then the second one takes the later period, the period from 1980 to 2000. And we see here that, again, there is a shift. Now, these two tables are not comparable in that the occupational classifications did change. They changed quite a bit. But what we do have is that we know that managerial, professional, technical, these are the higher paying occupations. And then like the farming, forestry, the labor occupation is the lowest one. And what we see is that a shifting again to from lower earning occupation to higher earning occupations. And I did for this period, I couldn't link these, I didn't, these indexes, but what I did was to do one, and we see in 1980 to 2000, there was an increase, again, looking at the last row, the numbers in red, in index of occupational standard. And finally, let's see, and finally, if we look at table 3, I didn't try to do the index of occupational standing here, but just to look at how occupational distribution changed, say, over this period, the last 10 years or so. And what we see is that, again, the higher paying occupation, for instance, in management, professional, and related, there was an increase in that percent. And in the lower paying one, it decreased. And so the bottom line is that there was some increase, in the occupational standing. But we can clearly see how the shift occurred. So from 1960 on, there has been occupational diversification and improvement. And professional sports is a perfect example of how the free enterprise system has enhanced the occupational uplift of Americans of African heritage. If you consider football, for instance. Now, except for one person who played and coached in the NFL, as the NFL was forming, and his name was Fritz Pollard. There were no Americans in the NFL, Americans of African heritage in the NFL until after the Second World War. The NFL was formed around 1920, and then this fella, Fritz Pollard, he was a player and a coach for several years, but there were no others. Okay, now, today, so after the Second World War, one of it was the Rams, I believe. Woody Strode was one of them that was hired. There were 4. But with 2 different teams. But once the door is open, there was no closing it. Today, 65% of the NFL is black. And players are earning big bucks. Big bucks. The quarterback for the Saints, Marshawn Lattimore, just signed an acceptance. He just accepted a contract for over 5 years for $97.6 or something like that $million. The only one that has a higher one is some fella who plays for the Rams, I believe. He's black too. Okay, now, therefore, how did this happen? How did this happen? You talked about it. And you laid it out. Competition and the pursuit of profit. That's how it happened. Owners wanted to win games and make money. Therefore, they could not pass up recruiting black players. They didn't have to like them. But they wanted to make money. And fans. Don't forget the benefit to the fans. They want a winning team. Free enterprise worked to the advantage of players, owners, and fans. And by the way, fans don't care. Fans, I'm from New Orleans. Alvin Kamara. white people wear his jerseys, Drew Brees, black people wear his jerseys. They don't care. They don't care. They just want the Saints to win. Okay, free markets break down economic discrimination. As long as discriminatory and exclusionary practices are not supported by government. You know, one of the things that has, I've been thinking about this, and one of the most important things is equal protection of the laws. But when the 14th Amendment, it's in the 14th Amendment, and when that amendment was ratified and passed, I'm sure what the Congress was seeing and looking at was that the freedmen were not being given equal protection of the laws. Now, if you don't have that, then you're limited in so many ways. If you don't have equal protection, all right. But that's very important. If there's something important for government to do, that's one of the things, to assure that everybody has equal protection of the laws. If we look at incomes, what we see by race and sex here, we have black males, females, and white males and white females. What we see is that over the period from 1972 to 1920, indeed, median incomes for individuals increased. But what jumps out here, though, is that the increase is like tremendous for females, whether it's white or black. But overall, there's this increase in median incomes, all right? So incomes did increase over this period. But this is something that's been clear, but the largest increases were for females and males. The ratio of black to white income, it increased, black to white income increased, except for females, because by 1972, black females were almost at a par with white females, and then relatively they lost ground there. And then we look at per capita income. Here's the most important thing that happened. Per capita income for the African American or Americans of African heritage population, it increased on an average per year of 3.69%. And that is the measure of standard of living most often used, per capita GDP for the nation, per capita income. And so by that standard, that was quite a bit of increase in living standards in a capitalist nation. So, in conclusion, as time has passed, African Americans have enjoyed higher and higher living standards, but not without interruptions and setbacks, as the economy has gone through numerous recessions during the past 50 to 60 years. However, over the long haul, occupational distribution has improved with greater diversification of the African American labor force. Individual incomes have risen and standards of living have increased. All of this has happened in a very capitalistic country. So, in closing, I'll have to agree with two comments by U2's Bono. Quote, "You can't take people out of poverty without entrepreneurial capitalism." End of quote. Secondly, quote, "Capitalism has taken more people out of poverty than any other ism." End of quote. And you can find that on YouTube. Thank you.
want to stick around for a few more minutes. We started late, but we have three guys who just gave you a lot of information. Do you have any questions, comments? Take it away, gentlemen.
That's a sexist remark, gentlemen
Well,
and women, ladies and gentlemen.
No.
Okay,
this lady.
go ahead. Oh, I'm sorry. No, us,
Had her
gentlemen.
hand up.
Go ahead, Jeannie.
Okay, I thank you for your presentation. My question is, much of the data presents people that are actually working. So you're dealing with apples to apples. But when we talk about income inequality, there are a number of people that don't work. So they're going to be in a different category. And if we changed it, and I don't know, I can't tell your data as much, in terms of, this is your last data, that there are a lot, I don't know, I don't know the data, but if you bring in all those that are not working and they have, they have income, they have welfare income, but they're not working, they don't get on the stream for the benefits of private capitalism. Am I right?
Well, yeah, yes, but I can't use that for looking at discrimination.
No, I know, I'm not questioning that, absolutely.
Yeah.
My point is that somehow we have to get the message out that you gotta be working
Yes,
in order to benefit
yes,
from the benefits
I see.
of free market capitalism.
Yeah, I would have a comment on that. It is true that today, well, over the last, let's say, maybe 50 years, the unemployment rate for blacks has been approximately twice that of whites. Okay. Now, interestingly, if you go back to the 40s and the 50s, that was not the case. Right? That was not the case. All right. So yeah, so it doesn't. So it doesn't address that issue. But there's an interesting question. Why? Why is it that people, African Americans, have higher unemployment rates relative, well, absolutely and relative to non-blacks today than in the 50s? And I and I would suggest it has some. Partly this is due to social policies. Partly, I can't say that explains all of that. But there's one. But the measure of per capita income is not based on whether or not the person is employed or unemployed. It's not based on just employed people. But when you look at occupations, they are because in like the data that I display there doesn't include unemployed people, and there is a certain number that are unemployed. Well, yes, that's true, but that's a problem. It's
a critical issue, and it is critically important in the debate today, because when numbers are provided, they're giving those numbers that include so many people that aren't working. And those people are not, they've made a choice, but the choice is being influenced, and it's preventing them from recognizing what they could do if they worked.
Yeah, I'll maybe offer one observation. The fact that the gap in unemployment rates between black and non-blacks has increased in a way that is correlated with the advent of the welfare state programs, which to put it bluntly, in some way or other pay people not to work, needs explanation. And as to why it would affect different groups differently. But there's no doubt that it does coincide with that. So that in this argument, when people are talking about the persistence of poverty and so on, and attributing that to the market, when actually it's very much more likely to be attributed to these so-called anti-poverty programs.
Walter Williams made it very clear in his books that the minimum wage got started in this country as a discriminatory tool of whites to shut blacks out of labor markets, because they did not want to whites did not want to compete with blacks in the labor market because blacks were willing to work for less. Blacks were willing to work for less. They had less experience. They needed a job and were willing to take the job to get the experience, which would have made them more productive so they could earn the higher salaries. Labor unions, which were dominated almost completely by whites, knew that. And so they established a minimum wage which set the bar so high that the employers chose not to hire the less experienced blacks. It was an act of discrimination. That's one public policy which has been used by government to raise the unemployment rates of blacks and discriminate against blacks. If I could point to any one thing that is hurting blacks more today, government policy and the economy, it's public schools.
Yeah.
Because public schools if you look at the quality of the schools in black neighborhoods, they tend to be far below the quality of the schools in white neighborhoods. If the public schools were privatized, then somebody who is running the schools as a corporation would say, enough of this, we're taking our school model down to these of the school, and we're replacing the way they teach with the way we teach. And the profit motive takes care of that. Peter mentioned another one that's doing it, right? That's hurting blacks, not helping them. Public policy. Right. But there's public policy after public policy after public policy, which supposedly is there to help minorities, but more often than not is being used as a tool to hurt minorities.
Ray.
This question is for all of you, but mainly Mike. Can you help us to understand causation about the freer states versus the less freer states? What's driving that?
What is causing some states to be freer than other states? That's a very complex question. You know? I mean, let me just say I don't have all the answers in 10 minutes, so let me take the comical approach to it. Be happy you don't have the mountains and the beach. And the really nice weather. Because when the government knows you have the mountains and the beach and the really nice weather, they can use that to extort from you a high degree of taxes and other things because they know you won't move, right? But we have to be nice here in Texas because there's only so much you'll put up with because to live here, you don't have the mountains, you don't have the beach, you don't have the climate that's nice all the time, and you can't, and so what are you going to do? You have to.
You needed AC.
Yeah. So, I mean, economists call it hedonics, but yeah. For Frank, he's here visiting. This is the scholar of my life right here. That I've been fortunate enough to know.
Well, I would just say that it's just the people in the state have made choices.
The state government?
Yes, they've made choices.
Yeah.
Uh,
Why us though? And
that we the people,
yeah.
and they've elected people who will do certain things. They've elected people who have said, well, we don't want to overtax people in Texas. We don't want to overtax people. So to me, it's now, and what Mike is saying, that makes sense too, in that. But what it really comes down to is that.
Yeah.
Is that the differences are due to the policies,
Yeah.
the state tax laws, that's what, and who are who's responsible for those? Well, the state legislatures, who the people elected.
Yes, and this just brings up an important point. The greatest thing about America is not that we're one big place, but is that we are united states, and that people can vote with their feet, and that if you don't like the policies of one state, you can leave. And people are leaving, and they're coming to Texas. And the number one migration that's happening in this country is the migration from California to Texas. And even the New Yorkers are coming here now. They used to be going to Florida, but now they're coming here. Tennessee is a newfound place for people to go to. Last year, it seemed that Tennessee, I think, might have beat Texas as a destination.
Yeah.
No, they don't have any income tax either. So.
One more guy.
It seems like when you control for education and occupation, that a noble goal would be to narrow the gap between the races for wages.
Yeah.
What your opinion would be on the role that just free markets plays versus other factors that could include public policy?
Okay, let me show you this. Education is the best, what do you call it? Deterrent, best cure, best for discrimination, right? I mean, get educated. Look at Asians. So this is the share of these four groups here in terms of what fraction has a high school degree on around to a bachelor's degree, master's, and so on. Now, high school, I'm going to say only high school. Asians, nope, I'm not stopping there. Hispanics. Look at the advanced degrees. And not only these advanced degrees and master's degrees that the Asians have, they're not just any master's degree. They're STEM science degrees. They're the high-paying master's degrees. They're directly useful degrees, right? So education is the best antidote. And it's, what Peter was saying, right? If I get educated, what employer is going to sit there and say, no, I'm paying only come on. I'm going to look at your skin color? No, of course not. It's what's on the inside that matters. The gray matter. It's the gray part. So, anyway.
I would also point something out that Thomas Sowell has done so much on, and that is, when we just look at, say, college degrees, all college degrees aren't equivalent. And so a college degree, a bachelor's degree in social work as opposed to a bachelor's degree in
Engineering or something.
information system.
Yeah, wow, yeah.
I mean, the earnings are just, there's just that disparity. Now, what happens is that where you have a group where a disproportionate large percentage of them are getting degrees in social work and not IT, then it's going to show up as a difference in incomes, even though
Yeah.
they do both have that degree, that bachelor's degree, but they're in different things. They are in, well, Thomas Sowell talks about high productivity courses, high productivity degrees, high productivity courses like statistics and so on, that are really going to add to your earning power. Clarence Thomas said that one of the things he did when he was in law school, he made sure that he took the very difficult law courses because he didn't want people to think that he was just sliding by. But in spite of all that, he said after he graduated, people look at his degree and say, oh, they must have given you those grades.
To your point.
Yeah. And he said, and he was livid.
Mm-hmm.
He was livid because they were saying to him, you must have been hired because they gave you preference. And he was livid. That's one of the main reasons why he is not for affirmative action. Because people, they look at someone and they assume that you just got these good grades in these hard classes because
Public
they
policy.
give you a pass. They gave you a pass for being black. And that wasn't the case.
All right, so we're not going to pay these guys overtime. All this, we can't afford it at the Bridwell Institute. But anyway, thank you very much. And